Okay, welcome back. Our speaker now is Dr. Stephen Rabe. He's a retired professor of history, University of University of Texas at Dallas. He is a former Marine, and let me explain what that means. See, the Navy wanted an army, but the army already existed, so they used the Marines as their own army. So it's much more military-like than the Navy. So I hope that makes sense somehow. Okay. So he is the author of The Lost Paratroopers of Normandy, a story of resistance, courage, and solidarity in a French village. And Steve and his family came to visit the museum 6-8 months ago. He presented the book to our book talk. It's a great story that he's going to tell us about, and I hope he will tell us about the publishing success that he has had related to this book. So, Steve Rabe, everybody.
Thank you everyone for coming. As John indicated, my book was released on 11 November on Veterans Day of 2022. Now, it's published by Cambridge University Press. Now, I've published many a book with university presses, and normally a university press book sells 500 to 1,000 copies. So Cambridge University Press thought this was pretty good, so they printed 3,000 copies. We sold that out in 3 weeks, and we've been going really strong to the point that in 2023, I finished #2 on Cambridge University Press bestsellers. Now, I'll qualify that for a second. I'll qualify for that. That's excluding versions of the Bible. Excluding versions of the Bible. What Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John have on me, I don't know, but they're selling better than I'm selling. There are Kindle and audio versions. The paperback will come out in May of this year, just before D-Day, and I hope for a movie. Several reviewers, including Kitty Kelly, famous for Jackie O, has suggested that her friend Steven Spielberg should read this book. Steven hasn't called yet, but if he does, I'll take the call. Now, seriously, one of the things, what is my book about? Cambridge University Press and other presses will usually ask you to boil your book down to one sentence. And my one sentence would be, ordinary people are capable of extraordinary things. But something we haven't yet mentioned in today's symposium, I would just modify that. Ordinary women are capable of extraordinary things, because the real central actors in this story are females. The females in the village of Gren, Normandy, which is about 10 kilometers, 6 miles due south of the port city of Carata. Another way to put it is, this is a fairy tale, but it's a fairy tale that is totally true, proven by my 553 footnotes. This is a University Press book, each with 3 or 4 sources. Okay. Now, the ordinary people, the silk from the sky. This is a wedding in the village of Gren at the end of 1944. Why is it silk from the sky? The 2 brides are attired in silk. Silk from the parachutes of the men who jumped down. They're reserve parachutes that arrived in the village of Gren on 6 June 1944. Spontaneously, when the paratroopers landed in the surrounding area, most of which was flooded, the people of Gren, including the women, went out into their flatboats to find all the parapacks, which had the supplies that the paratroopers had dropped. Their 2 81mm mortars, their 5 light machine guns. This was a headquarters company of the 507th Regiment, the 3rd Battalion, so there's lots of medical supplies. But also, they went and retrieved the reserve chutes. And in the post-liberation period, they began to fashion First Communion dresses, confirmation dresses, and wedding dresses. These are 2 wedding dresses here that are fashioned out of parachute silk. I have been in the homes of the villagers 80 years later. They still have the parachute dresses, and they still use those dresses, which are fashioned. And you can notice right at the often at the hemline, there's a kind of an indelible ink, a number that the military put in 1944. So this is the famous Silk from the Sky wedding. These are all villagers who risked everything to save the people that to this day they call the liberators or our paras, our paratroopers. In particular, the women, as you look at it to the right, Odette was particularly influential in rescuing paratroopers. She called herself a soldier of the resistance. And a few places down, there's a girl, let's see, 3 places down, there is a girl named Marthe, her sister Rabe, who went out into the bushes and found paratroopers and brought them to the family barn. And they would hide them for 3 days. Because if they had been caught by the Germans, we're speaking about the invading force ultimately here of the Waffen-SS, they were executing any American they found, immediately executing any American. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about myself and then a little bit about why I wrote this book. I am not a military historian, but as you heard, I am a U.S. Marine, and I was an 0311, a grunt, a non-commissioned officer, equivalent in the Army of, I think, a lieutenant colonel or something, if you're a non-commissioned officer in the Marines. Okay. I'm a trained historian. I received my Ph.D. in history in U.S. Foreign Relations at the University of Connecticut, also known as the basketball capital of the world, of the universe, of the galaxy, whatever, with 16 national championships and 2 pending this weekend. I was a university teacher for 45 years. I'm now retired from teaching. I've written 13 scholarly books, mainly in the field of U.S. foreign relations and Latin America. Now, during the course of my career, I had the privilege of lecturing in 20 countries. And my experience in teaching in other countries, taught for a full year in Finland, taught for a full year at the University of Helsinki, a full year at the University College Dublin, is that if you're going to tell the proper history of U.S. foreign relations, you have to look at all perspectives. You have to do multi-archival research, and you have to bring in the perspectives of other countries that the United States is interacting with. So in this case, there are 3 actors, the French, German, and U.S. actors in the village of Gren between June 6th and 16 June 1944. So I did multi-archival work, and I did multi-interviewing, not of Germans, but certainly of the French and Americans. Although, as I said, I am not a military historian, I did serve on active and reserve duty for the U.S. Marine Corps for 6 years, so I'm roughly familiar with things military. And as I said, I was an 0311, a grunt. Now, an important thing to know about me in this book is that I, my sister, my brother, my father, my daughter, and my 2 grandchildren all owe their lives to the people of the village of Gren, into this Norman village. The villagers during the period after 11-12 June 1944 aided in the escape of over 100 paratroopers from the village after the village was overrun by Nazi forces, and this was the 17th Waffen-SS Division. My father, you see it there to the left, Staff Sergeant Rabe, landed near Gren on D-Day. More than 60 years ago, actually probably 70 years ago, he told me that a friendly farm family had hid him and others in the loft of the barn for 3 days. He became ravenously hungry, but he endly told his children that the best meal he had ever had was when the family served the paratroopers cabbage with melting butter. And it was usually kind of a homily to myself, my brother, and my sister that who were perhaps resisting the food that my mother cooked, that we should be appreciative of that food. After I jumped off the pleasant academic carousel, I decided to pursue this story of 1944. The story of Gren was far more meaningful than I could have imagined. People have asked me, well, how long did it take you to write the book? And I said, 60 to 70 years it took me, because I had the idea percolating in my head. My father told me a lot of stories. I never quite understood what he was speaking about, because I knew that he spent 7 weeks fighting in Normandy, and so what is he talking about, hiding in a barn here, et cetera? So I didn't quite know. Now, again, those are my 2 grandchildren, the great-grandchildren of Staff Sergeant Rabe. And if I'd have just a time of personal privilege, I use the numbers 43210 to describe my father. 4 Bronze Stars, 3 battlefield promotions, 2 Purple Hearts, 1 amputated toe left in Belgium, Luxembourg during the Battle of the Bulge, and 0 days missed between June 1944 and May of 1945, between the jump on Normandy and to VE Day. What you see him there is standing in occupied Berlin in September of 1945. He had just marched in the Allied victory parade down Unter den Linden. The thing that strikes me most about that photo, he is all of 21 years of age. And I've taught 10,000 university students. I've had plenty of 21-year-olds who are basically juniors, third-year students in college. I have never seen a 21-year-old look like that. And these are the great-grandchildren that he never met. Now, I don't want to romanticize. He had severe PTSD in the post-war period, particularly starting in his 40s. And what I found, to my shock and horror, is that every veteran of this particular adventure here, every one of them ultimately suffered PTSD of one form or another, usually the most common being alcoholism. Okay. So, why is my book unique? I'm a professional historian, and as I said, I focus mainly on U.S. foreign relations. A variety of people had tried to write about Gren. It's fairly well known. In a variety of guidebooks of Normandy, you'll find that there is a little story about the village of Gren and what happened between June 6th and June 16th. But I had been to reunions of veterans in the 1950s and 1960s. My father had taken me along. So when I began my research, the first thing I did was look up the names of people I had met when I was 10 or 12 years of age. There were a couple of women that I really had the hots for when I was 12, and I wrote and said, how could you have forsaken me over these last 60 years, etc. The children of veterans were very appreciative, and they began to send me material that they had never shared with anyone. And to a certain extent, the key is I'm a professional historian, and my father had been at this. And they were sharing things that they wouldn't share with other historians who had approached them. Even my sister conducted so-called attic research, and she actually found a whole cache of material that my father had in terms of photos and documents that we did not know existed. The paratroopers themselves, and as the research began to extend outward, the paratroopers were legends in their own towns. I mean, they were members of the 82nd, and in emerging from World War II, the 82nd was the legendary division of World War II. The 82nd was asked to march on the Allied victory parade in January of 1945 down Fifth Avenue, representing the entire U.S. military. Local newspapers in small towns, whenever D-Day came about or Veterans Day came about, they would search out these veterans of the 82nd Airborne, and they'd write stories about them. I actually watched tapes made by the grandchildren of the members of the 82nd who had done stories for their high school history project. So let's do a story about Grandpa because he'd been a member of the 82nd. Now again, to gain access to this material and the trust of the children and the grandchildren, you had to be a professional historian, and your father had to have been in Gren as their grandfathers and parents had been. In terms of the French perspective, there's an extensive collection of oral histories in France, particularly at the Museum at Caen, where about the Normandy campaign, including testimonies from the villagers of Gren. Then there are German records available. One would think that most German records have been destroyed in the last year of the war, etc., but there are very extensive German military records. The mayor of Gren, Dennis Small, had been collecting all of the records of the Germans, and particularly the transmissions of the Waffen-SS in the days that they attacked the village. Unfortunately, Mayor Small does not read German, but my wife, Janice Rabe, does read German. So she spent a full year translating the logbook of the transmissions of the Waffen-SS. This was really hard work because it was all in types of German military acronyms. But over the years, she became an expert in German military equipment and German military acronyms, etc. She also read German language books published by German historians and members of the SS unit. And quite interestingly, 30, 40, 50 years after the fact, the veterans of the SS unit were still covering up about what exactly had happened in the village of Gren, which were very, very obvious war crimes. Let's see here. Yes, this is my wife and Mayor Small poring over the German documents. So it was very fortunate when we met with Mayor Small that he had all these documents and he shared them. Finally, let's see here. I got a map. Now, this map is not so good. I noticed in Professor McManus's highly detailed maps, he did not have the village of Gren. The village of Gren is south of the port city of Keraton, which is an inward port that splits Omaha and Utah beaches. It's about 10 kilometers. It's in the general where the area of rivers are. The paratroopers as a group, this group of paratroopers from the 3rd Headquarters Company of the 3rd Battalion of the 507th Regiment were as a group the farthest off target. They were about 20, 25 miles off target from where they were supposed to be, and you have a better map that shows you the drop zone of the 82nd Airborne, the intended drop zone. So they are, as a group, the farthest off. There are individual paratroopers who are dropped in the English Channel who are as far as 40 miles off target. But as a group, there were about 145 people who were off target. Right? Now, let's give here, and again, the map you have in the brochure that the U.S. Army Museum has prepared for you gives you a better sense of it. But it's about 10 kilometers south of Keraton. But even today, it seems a kind of very remote, isolated place. The village of Gren is a very old village. It was part of William the Conqueror of 1066, a land grant to a supporter of his. And it had about 900 people. It traditionally was an agricultural village. It specialized in the famous Norman cows, producing milk and cheese, as well as producing orchards for Calvados. Now, let me just tell you what happened, since obviously most people would not know what had happened here in the village of Gren between 6 and 16 June 1944. So it's a kind of a quick synopsis. At 11:59, members of the 507th Regiment took off from England. At 2:38 a.m., members of the Headquarters Company began to hit land around the village of Gren. There were about 143 paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne who hit around the village of Gren, a village of 900 people. Now, this village is an unoccupied village, and that's important to know. It was an unoccupied village, but there are Germans everywhere around in the area. It's about, as I said, 10 kilometers south of the port city of Keraton. Most of the land naturally is marshes or marais, in that the land is essentially below sea level. But quite quickly, 5 paratroopers would die from drowning. Now, the water was only generally about 3-4 feet. It was much higher than normal because the Germans had backed up the rivers. They were closing off the normal passages of the rivers into the English Channel. So when paratroopers fell into drainage ditches, which were 5 or 6 feet, they were in very, very deep trouble. 5 paratroopers died almost immediately from drowning. And over the next several days, the battalion surgeon, since this was a headquarters company that had 9 medical personnel, the battalion surgeon was spending a lot of time dealing with slashing wounds as the paratroopers, desperate, were just going at their risers with the knife that they kept right here. The paratroopers are 20 miles off, 31 kilometers off target. Now, at the same time, a plane load from the 101st inexplicably landed near the village with about 19 men. 1 died. A glider plane attached to the 101st unit plopped into the marais surrounding the village. Now, and over the next couple of days, a variety of other people will wander into the village also, including 2 men from Omaha Beach, as I'll show you and I'll talk about in a second. Inexplicable. Omaha Beach is about 40 miles from the village of Gren, and 2 guys lost wandered into the village. Now, the paratroopers will eventually assemble in the village of Gren, which is just about 50 meters higher than the surrounding marais, which is, again, as I said, below sea level. Spontaneously, with no asking from the paratroopers, the villagers, when they saw what was happening, which they perceive in almost miraculous terms, and they say, we live at the end of the earth. What's happening here? I mean, they knew that the invasion was coming, and they could hear the sounds and the fire, etc. But this was almost inexplicable to them. But the villagers took to their flatboats into the marais and retrieved the equipment. the mortars, the machine guns, the ammunition, the medical supplies. After a furious debate, the two ranking officers, Major Johnston, who's the executive officer of the battalion, and Captain Brummett, who I think is head of S2 in the battalion, Major Johnson makes the decision that the unit will stay in Gren and wait for the invading forces, presumably from Omaha Beach, to reach the Lost Paratroopers. The mayor himself met with Major Johnson and asked the paratroopers to stay and protect them. Simultaneously, 200 miles away, the new Waffen-SS 17th Division receives orders to move northward and take the port city of Karatah, which splits Omaha and Utah Beach. And there is a very large German contingent in Karatah. Now, on 7 June, the men of the village, led by the mayor and the parish priest, who is a veteran of World War I, unanimously vote in a church meeting to support the paratroopers. At the same time, the women of the village, though they're not allowed to attend the men-only meeting in the church, led by the cafe owner, Madame Bossier, agreed to cook around the clock for the paratroopers. The women will begin to enter occupied villages to obtain additional food. They didn't have a bakery in the village of Gren, and the men need to have their baguettes. So the women of the village would, with their horse-driven wagons, would go into occupied villages, meet with people that they know, collect additional food, and then surreptitiously just pass German checkpoints, putting the food under the hay and whatever as they just drove through. On 7 to 9 June, the paratroopers set up their defenses. They set up their aiming points. They dig their foxholes. They patrol, often aided by the villagers. There are minor clashes with the Germans. On 9 June, the troopers blow up a bridge to the north and rout a German force to make sure that Germans couldn't attack them from the area of Karatah. They suffer one minor casualty. Then on June 9th, 2 men from infantry, from the 29th Infantry, wander into the village of Gren. From Major Johnston's point of view, the plan is working. We're waiting for the people of Omaha Beach to come to us. The French men provide intelligence and accompany on patrols. They actually wanted to have weapons, and the paratroopers dissuaded them from doing that because they would be immediately executed if caught. The women obtain food and cook. The children in the village bring the food to the paratroopers who are all in their foxholes. The 17th Waffen-SS Division slowly makes its way towards Karatah. They lack sufficient transport vehicles. They can only send 2 of their 3 battalions. The 3rd battalion has to come on bicycle, and they are bedeviled by P-51 attacks. I can always remember my father telling me that the paratroopers' best friend was the P-51. And so the P-51 were attacking them as they're slowly moving towards Karatah. On 10 June, paratroopers on the flanks of the defense clash with advance parties of the 17th SS. They examine documents on the German bodies and realizing major force is approaching. But already by this time, the 17th Waffen-SS is a couple days behind schedule because they have been so bedeviled by attacks from the air by the P-51 during the day. They have to move only at night and on the smaller roads rather than on the main roads. Now, the climactic turn in the village occurs on 11 to 12 June, 1944, which is Sunday to Monday morning. There is a first attack while the men were attending church services, and a large number of the men were Catholic. They hear that the Germans are attacking them. This is a Ukrainian, made up of Ukrainian volunteers. It's not the Waffen-SS. They attack the village in the morning. They suffer a terrible defeat. My estimates are that the paratroopers killed 500 of these Ukrainian forces and suffered 0 casualties, 0 casualties. They cannot believe what has happened. The Ukrainians come right up the roads they have pre-targeted. They just walk into something they don't know what's going to happen to them. They don't fight very effectively, and the paratroopers lose no casualties, and they inflict something up to 500 casualties on the morning of 11 June. But in the afternoon, finally, the 17th Waffen-SS has arrived in the area. They begin to attack in the afternoon. This is a probing attack by the 1st Battalion of the 37th Regiment of the 17th SS Division. They accurately assess U.S. strength. The cables show that they say, well, there's about a company's worth of strength here. There's about 160, 165 men, although many of the men are not armed because they're medics, part of the medical personnel there. There are casualties on both sides. The paratroopers begin to tighten their defenses. They are running out of ammunition. The officers meet in the afternoon and discuss what to do. Major Johnston rules we stay. It appears to me that Major Johnston understood the situation, but he couldn't bear the thought of leaving the villagers, given everything the villagers had done for them. The third German attack begins late in the afternoon and evening of June 11th, Sunday, June 11th. They have brought up artillery. The artillery is out of the distance of the 281 millimeter mortars. They begin to bombard the village, they begin to destroy the church, and then they move in. The paratroopers run out of ammunition, completely run out of ammunition. There's the destruction of the church. The paratroopers without ammunition are given the order to withdraw. By this time, Major Johnston himself has died. They leave the wounded and medical personnel behind. So a first aid station had been set up in the sacristy of the church. There are some wounded American paratroopers. There's very large medical personnel because this was the headquarters company. The SS troops, when they enter the town, they loot the town and commit war crimes. They do not pursue the retreating U.S. troops because, one, I think they're sky high on methamphetamines. As we know, the Germans are fond of giving their troops methamphetamines. And then they break into the wine cellars and they drink and just kind of rampage through the town, murdering both villagers and as well as paratroopers. Between 12 June and 16 June, about 110 paratroopers would ultimately make it to safety in the headquarters of the 82nd and 101st Airborne. They are aided by the rural French. 21 of them, including my father, would be hidden for 3 days in the farm of the Rabe family, which is a little bit off from Gren. It's about 3 kilometers. Remarkably, those who eventually made it back to headquarters would survive Normandy, except the next 6 weeks in Normandy. They would survive the Battle of the Bulge. They would survive the jump over the Rhine River. They would survive Rhineland fighting. As Major General John Gavin once said, if you can survive your first battle, you're probably going to be all right. Or as he wrote to his daughter once, I surprise myself how fast I can get under a flat rock in the aftermath. And ultimately, these men who are saved here in the village of Gren would liberate tens of thousands of Eastern European slave laborers who were working in German war factories in the Rhineland area. Some, like my father, would serve in occupied Berlin. That is to say, some of them, like my father, would make what I would consider one of the most epic journeys in human history, from Normandy to Berlin. From Normandy to Berlin. I mean, it's akin to Alexander's travels or Marco Polo's, whatever. This is one of the most epic journeys in human history. One thing, of course, is this story's not over in terms of the synopsis. From the end of June to the end of August, the Nazis will ultimately force all the people out of the town, and they'll be on the road for the next month. They will burn the town to the ground, trying to cover up the crimes that they have committed there. The village would be destroyed by torching and warfare in the region. The village of Gren experiences the most destruction of any village in Normandy. I think it's like 98% of all the buildings are either destroyed or damaged. And again, not to get ahead of myself, the most remarkable thing is they don't regret it. You ask them today, no, we don't regret it. They didn't regret it then. They don't regret it. They don't regret it now. And you ask them why? They give you the ideals of the French Revolution and the American Revolution. Liberty, equality, and fraternity. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's simple to them. A couple of more pictures here. Let's see, this is the church. This is the church as it existed. It was a beautiful Romanesque 12th century church. And that's what it looks like after the Germans had bombarded it. This is the surrounding area, the Marais. You can see the flooding here. Now, it's not like this today. This is extreme flooding from the backing up of the rivers. But leading little Marthe there in the boat with her little brother, Jean-Claude, I thought I lived on the end of the earth. Now, there are several historical issues to pursue here, beyond the basic story. Why are the paratroopers lost? The answer is, I don't know. They don't know. The second person in office, Captain John Brubbett, said, I spent 50 years trying to figure out why we are lost. Why are we so far off target? And he said, after 50 years, I still don't know. The obvious issues come back. The clouds, the extreme flak. These are nine C-47s, kind of going in the V of Vs. The other 8 are following the lead one. Maybe they followed the wrong river, got confused somehow or other. And then people don't know, well, why did you jump here? The other people in the other 8 planes said, well, they started jumping in the lead plane, so we decided to jump too. As Professor McManus controlled the controlled chaos of the paratroopers. The men jumped ultimately at 350 to 500 feet. The planes were violently bucking. Many landed, of course, as I said, in the water, and some drowned, and others had to really struggle to survive the water. My father said the plane was bucking so much, he told me that everyone was getting airsick, that there was a bucket, and the bucket was being passed, and just before they jumped, somebody inadvertently kicked over the bucket. So my father, the comedian, said, we didn't jump over Normandy, we slid out. I will say that they jumped so low that my father told me that his helmet normally would be the first thing he would push up after the parachute opened from the shock. They would fall over his head, he'd push it up. He said he pushed up his helmet, and he hit. They were jumping at that low. A lot of the men did have sprained ankles, and a couple had hairline fractures, etc. Now, the next thing is, so I don't know. I can't give you the answer why they're so far off target, and they don't know either. Why did the paratroopers stay in Britain? This is a big fight among the paratroopers. All the other officers testified they had never seen 2 officers yelling at each other with such intensity. Major Johnson makes the decision to stay. The number 2 person in command, Captain Brummett, wanted to reorganize and go find where they were supposed to be. Now, he made these points. We are a headquarters company. We are in support of the 3 infantry companies in our battalion. We've got to fulfill our mission. We've got to get back to those men, to get back to Amfreville, where we were supposed to land, which is just west of Saint Michel. He also questioned whether they would be able to fight effectively. He said, we're not an infantry company, we're a headquarters company. We have 9 unarmed medical people with us. This is not our duty. The obvious would be that the company, if it stayed there, had no support. No air support, no artillery support, no tanks, no resupply, etc. They did have 2 carrier pigeons. And they sent the carrier pigeon, and remarkably, somebody found the dead carrier pigeon with the message giving their coordinates and saying, can you help us? And the 82nd got this, headquarters got it, they had no personnel there, and they actually sent out, anybody in the area, go help these men, but there's nobody in the area. Eventually, with the 2nd pigeon, it was making too much noise, so it was sacrificed. Now, Major Johnston made the decision to stay in place and to wait for the men from the Omaha Beach. He argued it's too difficult to reach Amfreville, we're too far away, more men will drown. I've got some men here who cannot swim. They had clearly been traumatized by the fact that 5 of them had drowned. Any paratrooper will tell you this is the worst way to go, to drown. They would have to abandon their 81 millimeter mortars, which are very heavy to carry. But the reality is here, people were making history. Individual people were making history. Major Johnston and large numbers of paratroopers were simply influenced by the enthusiasm of the villagers and the fact that they were doing everything and ultimately that they did everything they promised to protect the paratroopers, to feed the paratroopers, to carry out reconnaissance for the paratroopers, to give them intelligence. Now the biggest question for me in the book to pursue, beyond the bromides of life, liberty, equality, fraternity, etc., why did the people come to the aid of the paratroopers? Now you have to understand, in the end, They lost everything. They lost their homes. They lost their church. They had to flee. There's total destruction, and the Nazis carry out atrocities in the village and kill people. So why is this? But they never regretted it. Well, you can go through a whole variety of things. They were tired of the occupation. They were a close-knit community that had existed for 1,000 years. Virtually everyone was Catholic. Virtually everyone was related to everyone else. When I showed you the picture of the silk from the sky, my guess is everyone was a cousin of everyone else. It was a very closely knit community, etc. They were tired of the occupation. The occupation was getting worse. Many of the middle-aged men in the village were veterans of World War I. They did not like the Boche, what they called the Germans. They didn't like the fact that rationing was being imposed on them. The Germans were stealing more of their agricultural produce. They didn't like the fact that the Germans were holding some of their younger sons as hostages in Germany. They didn't like the fact that the Germans were now trying to draft other young men to work in German factories. But there is also this sense, it seems to me, that when they these paratroopers coming, it's just a total shock to them that they felt that they were receiving some sort of message. 20 years after the fact, in 1964, the parish priest said he compared the paratroopers coming to Guerin on 6 June 1944 to God sending his only son, Jesus, down to earth. If you go to the church at St. Marie, you will see in the stained glass windows the paratroopers coming down to rescue the Virgin Mary and Jesus and whatever. On the day that the Germans attacked on 11 June, the parish priest was talking about the miracle of Fatima, of the Virgin Mary coming to talk to Portuguese children. To me, I feel that they believed that they received the sign. They believed that God often spoke to individuals, and God had spoken to them. Now was the time to do something beyond simply complaining. I think it does matter that they had this kind of sense of resistance, that they could openly talk. They could go into Madame Bossier's cafe and talk and grouse about the Germans. But it seems to me that they really felt that they'd received a sign. Now, in terms of the local heroes here, we might just look at a few. You see there to the left, the man with all the medals. He's a member of the formal resistance, Alfred. He'd been a hero of World War I. He was the leader of resistance. He looks like a type of guy you'd want on your side. Remember all those medals. In the middle is Mayor Ph.D., who was the acting mayor. When eventually the Germans overran the town, they were looking for the mayor, and since they would say, well, the mayor was dead. Well, that was true, the mayor's dead. But that's the acting mayor, and he's in hiding. There is Madame Rigaud and Gustave Rigaud. Gustave Rigaud is a veteran of World War I. They have their little son, Jean-Claude, there. They are those who hide the paratroopers in their barn. And again, think about it. They were risking the life of little Jean-Claude to hide these 21 people in their barn for 3 days. Down on the second row is Madame Bossier, the head of the local cafe, who organized all the women of the village to provide food. And then finally, in the Marais, there are the Marthe and Odette Rigaud, who helped organize getting the paratroopers and hiding the paratroopers in the thing. Finally here, what I want to note is that when the Nazis came in terms of Nazi war crimes, that when the Nazis came in, wounded people had been left behind, as well as medical personnel. The Nazis murdered all of them. In addition, they murdered the priest and his acolyte, Father Le Blastier, and his acolyte because they were helping wounded Americans. So they committed a whole variety of war crimes. There's Father Le Blastier, who is executed. There is one of the men, Richard Hoffman. I could tell, for example, 9 men were forced to dig their own graves and kneel down, and then they were shot in the back of the head. I did a lot of looking at postmortems by grave registration. There, Richard Hoffman to the right. He's missing his hands and his lower mandible, his lower jaw. Well, he was shot in the back of the head. He had his hands like that, and they blew it off. I found several bodies like that. And there is the person who oversaw the execution. His name is Fritz Swoboda of the 17th SS. He had been responsible for overseeing the murder of 600 people in Prague in previous years. He ultimately was a prisoner here at Fort Hunt, not very far from us. But because the whole prison was illegal, he was never prosecuted. He openly admitted murdering 9 U.S. soldiers at Gren. So war crimes were committed. Let me just go, we're running out of time here. Let me just go here. I call victory. This is at the 75th anniversary of Gren. That's Mart Rabe, who is greeting an old paratrooper who jumped that day on the 75th anniversary in 2019. Mart is quite a pistol. Come another month or so, Reuters, UPI, BBC, they'll all be lined up outside her door. She'll welcome them in. She's 92 now. She loves being famous. On her mantle, she has a letter from General Eisenhower thanking her parents for the aid to the U.S. paratroopers. She has the Distinguished Service Medal from the Department of Army in 1986. It's the highest award the Department of Army can give to civilians. She has letters from presidents showing how bipartisan she is. She has letters from President Reagan and Obama thanking her and her family for their service to the United States. I mean, she's this little old lady, and you go into her house, and she's got on her mantle letters from Reagan and Obama and General Eisenhower. It's really quite amazing. And I would say, of course, for me, meeting her, and I'll leave it here, it's an overwhelming experience to meet someone who made your own life possible, but also the lives of, and more important, the lives of your grandchildren. I mean, I have met many of the people that I know that I've interviewed have met them because she saved their fathers also, and they said they just sobbed uncontrollably when they meet her. So it's quite an experience. It's a fairy tale, but it's a true story. Thanks for listening to me.
Confused. The village that they were in till the 16th, why did it take the Americans so long to take the village? You said that when were these crimes committed against the village?
The crimes were all committed on the nights of 11 and 12 June. So it was during the time of the military action. The allegation was, okay, we can kill all the people in the sacristy who were wounded. And what they did is the men who couldn't walk, they immediately shot. The ones that they could walk, they kept bayoneting them and pushing them into a pond until they died. Okay. The other 9, then they began to realize, okay, the villagers are seeing this. So they marched the other 9 a little bit farther away into an adjoining village, and then did the thing, of dig your own grave, shoot you in the head. In addition, they murdered Father Le Blastier and his acolyte. Their crimes were they were aiding the wounded Americans, and then they murdered the 2 housekeepers who were in their 80s because they were aiding wounded people. And then they felt they could destroy the church because they were using the sacristy as a medical aid station. The excuse given for murdering the 9 is, well, you shot one of our officers. Well, they killed one of their officers in battle. This was just pure murder. As one Eddie Page, Tech Sergeant Eddie Page once said, this wasn't war, this was murder. This was murder. The worst thing is we had the perpetrator of these murders in our own custody, but ultimately let him go.
When did the Americans take the village?
The village was finally liberated in late July 1944. So the people then could return in August of 1944 back to their burnt-out homes.
So it took a while for them to get to the village, or
it just took them a while. It wasn't a main thing. The other key thing here is that because they slowed the Waffen SS down, it gave the 101st more time first to take the port city of Karatah and then to secure it. The 17th Waffen SS would launch an attack on the 13th of June, but by that time the 101st had consolidated its position in the port city of Karatah. General Bradley, General Eisenhower considered holding Karatah is absolutely essential.
Why was the one who committed the crimes at Swoboda, why was he let out?
Because he was captured in France in 1944 and transported to the United States as a person of interest because he was just bragging about who he had killed. He was interrogated here at Fort Hunt, which was a special prison not recognized and not announced as a prisoner of war camp. The prison was entirely infiltrated by stooges, by people pretending to be Germans. It was, all the interrogators were German emigres, Jewish German emigres who spoke flawless German. They weren't tortured, but they were also, everything was wiretapped. They got everything on everyone, but then they couldn't prosecute them ultimately because they felt it was probably violating various Geneva Accords. In addition, they wanted to move all these people out because you know who came next to places like Fort Hunt? Anyone know? People like Werner von Braun and the variety of German scientists who all turned out to be Nazis themselves. Yes. So he was just released. This man that I showed you, who murdered the 9 Americans and oversaw the murder of 600 people, he died in his mid-80s at a spa town in Austria in a nice assisted residence living in his mid-80s. He suffered no punishment for what he did. He oversaw the murder of 600 people in Prague after the murder of the German commander in Prague.
How many jumps did your father have, and did he have post-World War II military service?
No, he did not have post-World War II service. He had 20 practice jumps and 2 combat jumps, Normandy jump, and then the jump over the Rhine River on 24 March 1945. By that time, the 507th Regiment had been transferred to the 17th Airborne, but then he got back into the 82nd in terms of occupied Germany. I'm glad you raised that question because I have 2 surprising findings from my research. One is I found that most of the paratroopers who, as someone said was, or Professor McManus said, was quite good at making trouble. That's quite true. That I found most of the paratroopers did not like to jump. They weren't enthusiastic about it, and some of them were just downright petrified. It was too damn dangerous, they thought. But why did they join the paratroopers? $50 a month. $50 a month plus $50 combat pay plus your regular pay of about $26, $27 gave you the pay of a mid-level British officer. So most of the men did it. They were quite frank about it, that they did it. The second thing, the surprising finding I found, was there was 100% post-traumatic stress disorder among all the men who served at Gren. And it wasn't just Gren, it was all the other things. What I found is most of them, in their memoirs or their accounts, spent more time on the Battle of the Bulge. That, from their perspective, was the absolute worst. And it was probably mainly because of the cold